when you try to understand the meaning in the Bible, you don't just look at what happens or what's said, but also where it happens and where it's said. And in Matthew 4, the temptation of Jesus, that event, the temptation of Jesus, happens just after his baptism and just before he calls his disciples and starts his ministry. And so if you look at Jesus' baptism, what happens just before the temptation, his baptism is really the announcement from God of who Jesus is to God. After he's baptized, he comes out of the water, and there's this voice from heaven declaring, "This is my son." That's who he is, whom I love, and with whom I am well pleased. The great succinct statement of who Jesus is to God. And so the reason that this story is scrunched in between these two events, the baptism and then the start of Jesus' ministry when he calls his disciples and starts teaching, is because the devil most desires to throw us off track before we start doing some cool stuff, before we start doing meaningful stuff. And the way the devil will attempt to do that most successfully is to get us to question who we are to God. So here's the temptation of Jesus coming right in between these two events in his life, finding out the declaration of who he is and when he's about to do his work, the stuff he came to do. So in Matthew 4, you read, just after the baptism, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Period. That's what's about to happen. And it's important to pause here because we see that Jesus was led there by God for this purpose, so that he could be tempted by the devil. And this is true despite the fact that later Jesus will teach us to pray, "Lead us, Father, not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." That's the Lord's Prayer. But here it's happening. God is leading for this purpose of temptation. So Jesus, he's out there, he's fasting 40 days and 40 nights, and it says he's hungry. Verse 2, 4 verse 2. And so the temptation of Christ, and perhaps our own temptation, points to the fact that it's usually going to happen when we are at our weakest moment. And perhaps that's what God wanted to show us, is that that's when it would happen. That's when we most have to be aware that it's about to hit. And so the first 2 points about the temptation of Christ here in chapter 4 that we point out is that that it's going to happen when you're about to do something significant, some significantly great work for God's kingdom or in God's kingdom. And it's going to happen when you're at your weakest moment. And then the third thing we're about to see, as I've already said, is the attack will come by attempting to get us to question who we are to God. Verse 3, the tempter came to Jesus and said, "If you are the Son of God," his first words to Jesus, if that's who you are, see how he's trying to twist to cause doubt. If it's true what I heard about you back at the baptism, then prove it. And right there you see the devil trying to manipulate shame in the life of Jesus. The way the devil manipulated shame in the life of Eve to say, prove it. Tell these stones to become bread. So the mode of attack will be against your sense of self, who you are to God. The attack will probably attempt to get you to prove yourself to God, to others, to yourself maybe. And whenever we have to do that, whenever we have to prove ourselves to others, we can tell we're probably being manipulated by shame. And if we're being manipulated if we're getting our shame manipulated, the odds are we're about to make a decision we're going to regret later. The Bible calls it sin. And even in this case, for example, while the attack comes in an attempt to get Jesus to prove himself, which may be for us also, it could be to prove yourself by doing something rather logical. Like in this case, make some food. I mean, why wouldn't you want to make some food? What's bad about making food? But what is bad is not the making of the food. It's the fact of being manipulated into doing it by shame through the devil. And what's interesting, side note here, tangent coming, we're going to see this exact thing echo again, this exact attack on Jesus at the end of his life. That's how his life starts in Matthew 4, and it's how his life is going to end, with somebody shouting up to Jesus on the cross, "If you are the Christ, prove it. Come down from there. If you are the Christ, prove it. Come down from there." Which, arguably, was the most significant thing that Jesus had to offer the world. And the devil thought, I have one last chance to apply the shame to Jesus' life. It clearly, while he's on the cross, every indication says he's not the Son of God. At that moment, the whole world is looking at him on the cross and thinking, that's not the Son of God. So if you were ever going to be motivated by a desire to prove that you are who God says you are, it's going to be in that moment. And it would have derailed the very reason Jesus came at all. Anyway, side note, sorry about that. Matthew 4. Jesus answered, "It's written, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." So basically, Jesus is saying, I live because God says so, because God says I will live, not because I eat food. That's why I live. That's how I live. So the devil tries again, a different way. Verse 5, the second temptation. The devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point in the temple. And he says the same words again. "If you are the Son of God, if that's who you are," he said, "throw yourself down. Jump. For it is written," and here Satan will quote the Bible. Okay? It's written, "He will command his angels concerning you, and if they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is written. It is also written. It is also written." So yes, Satan, that's an interesting Bible text you just gave me there. But it also says this in the Bible: do not put your Lord your God to the test. And here's one of my favorite passages in the entire Bible, because Jesus points out a great reality in the Bible. And that is, for every verse you quote, there's another verse that may contradict the text you are using. That is how the Bible is. And the point I try to make to people is, don't use the Bible, a verse, to prove your point to me anyway, because I can show you a verse saying almost the exact opposite thing. And that's exactly what happened here, right here in Matthew. And the fact of the matter is, many people, maybe everyone, wants to use the Bible to prove their point. Even me. Especially politicians today. But not everyone who quotes the Bible is using it correctly, even me. And many people who are quoting the Bible are doing it to gain some sort of leverage over you, to get you to act in a way they want you to act, as is the case here, where Satan is doing it to Jesus. And it's also possible, as is the case here, where people we meet in life will quote the Bible and be using it satanically. Especially, I would suggest to you, politicians, power seekers. People who need and want to convince you to behave the way they want you to behave, to make decisions the way they want you to make. So you are being manipulated by that very text for their own purposes, not for God's purposes, but for their purposes. So anyway, that didn't work. So verse 8 says, "Again the devil took Jesus to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And the devil says, 'All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me.'" Now this is just a more clever way of saying, if you are the Son of God. He's trying to say, clearly you are not, because if you were the Son of God, all of this would already be yours. And instead, look at you. You're small. You're weak. You're poor. Frankly, this is the most, I think, brutal type of shame attack on our sense of self that we can face as humans. The devil is suggesting that there's something we need that we're missing. And if we were truly God's children, we would have that thing. We would have kingdoms and children and spouses, and we would have everything that we've ever wanted and needed. And this is really a full frontal attack on who we actually are to God. I think it's what made Eve grab the apple in the garden. She felt she was lacking. The devil said, "Surely God would want you to know the difference between good and evil, wouldn't God?" Yeah, why wouldn't I want to know that? Why wouldn't I want to make some food out of rocks? Why wouldn't I do that? It's logical. God loves me. He would want me to eat. He would want me to know the difference between good. Suddenly it challenges our sense of self if we find out we're lacking something. And in all these things, shame's the trigger. We are triggered by shame to have to defend ourselves and who we are to God, because we are afraid that we may not actually be to God who God says we are. And what's interesting about Jesus, unlike me and most of humanity, is that Jesus doesn't bite. He doesn't buy it. Jesus is perhaps one of the few humans in the world who clearly understands who he is to God. And Jesus understands that our sinning, our decision making, is empowered by that knowledge, by that awareness. And Jesus is aware that the way the devil will attempt to get us to sin, to make harmful decisions, is to attack that sense, that empowerment we have. And these three temptations are going to come through, according to this passage, three different ways. Prove it through your actions. Prove to the world that you are a child of God. Do something. Prove it. And it's going to come through forcing God's actions. If you are the Son of God, make God do something for you. If you're really a child of God, then make God catch you when you're falling. And here's a side note. God doesn't always catch us. He doesn't always catch us. And that can hurt us. It can make us question God. We can make us question who God is. It can make us question who we are to God when God does not catch us and we land hard. But it doesn't diminish. Jesus knew it does not diminish who God is, and it does not diminish who we are to God. The third form of proving who we are to God is through what we possess. That if we're lacking something, it means we're not loved. That God could not say to us, of us, this is my son, this is my daughter, whom I love, and with whom I am well pleased, if we find out there's something we just don't possess on earth. The devil's primary lever in our lives, we saw it in Genesis, is to utilize shame to make us doubt who we are to God and to manipulate us in any way he can, the devil can, to derail us from having a significant impact in this world for God and God's kingdom. And it will happen through the devil's attempt to make us question who we are to God. Just like it happened in this context. Between the announcement of Jesus' baptism, this is my son, and the beginning of what the son was actually supposed to do. That's the devil's endgame. One of the differences, or the difference, and the reason I think this passage is in there is to make us aware that's the endgame. So that, like Jesus, we can push back and know exactly who we are and finish the work that God has put before us, empowered by that knowledge that you are the son, you are the daughter of God, whom he loves, and with whom he is well pleased.